Episode 2. Casey. Casey was never under the illusion that going into exile would be the best decision he'd ever made. In fact, it had to be in his bottom 3 worst of all time. He was wanted for murder in Neil's Dome, his former community. So, he considered it a stroke of sheer luck when one of the supplier's convoys arrived out of the blue. It was at least 5 years since the last convoy came through, and there was no telling how long it would be until the next. It was, in fact, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Casey because, without the convoy, he would be executed and used to fertilize mushrooms. Neil's Dome had a rigorous justice system as well as efficient waste management, and Casey wanted no part in either. Bribing and sneaking his way past members of Dome security, he approached the nearest parked rig of the convoy, which was named Menagerie. Convoy Menagerie's various rigs had been built for work in the pre-Inferno days, but no one was sure what that work had been anymore. Each rig had been hacked apart and reshaped over the centuries, making it all but impossible to tell their original forms. The best guess the convoy's managers had was that they had been used for some type of mining or quarrying. This made a kind of sense. Despite the variation between any two, each rig had a practical, brutalist approach to its design. Casey strode up the access ramp which descended from an opening in the side of the rig. It was only wide enough to hold 2 people standing shoulder to shoulder and seemed well used. Faded letters spelled out the rig's name underfoot. Skunk Babe Number 9. At the top of the ramp was a decal of a cartoon skunk raising its tail in self-defense. Casey looked up, squinting, trying to take in the shape of the whole rig at once. The Skunk Babe's body was egg-shaped. A drill bit hung off one end, and something that might once have been a crane lifted high off the other. If Casey let his eyes lose focus, he could see what the suppliers were going for. The crane was the skunk's tail, the drill bit its nose. To Casey, however, the rig looked like a titanic, headless, wingless, legless goose perched on caterpillar-style treads. He decided to keep this observation to himself. The office into which Casey stepped was so small that there was barely any room to stand. The majority of the room was taken up by a kiosk, behind which stood a bored-looking middle-aged man. He wore a gray coverall filled with pockets under a silver tool vest. The vest itself was covered in stencil lines of a green reflective material that gave the impression of tall grass waving in the wind. Casey felt like he was looking through the man's torso and into another world. The man's heterochromic eyes widened when he saw Casey. "What can I do for you?" he asked. "Does this convoy go to Lavina?" Casey responded, forcing himself to sound casual. A long silence stretched between them. Casey watched the supplier's face, but he may as well have studied a wood block. He was about to open his mouth and speak again when the supplier answered. "Yes. We go to Lavina. It's the next community on our route." His voice was clear and quiet as he spoke, carefully articulated so that each word was pronounced in its entirety. "I need to get there," Casey said. Another long silence. This time, the supplier didn't respond, so Casey continued. "I read that the suppliers take on passengers who are willing to work or pay. I have engineering skills. May I become a passenger of this convoy?" "You may apply to become a passenger," the supplier answered. The man reached under the kiosk's counter, pulling out a ledger nearly as long as Casey's forearm and laying it open between them. The ledger's pages were covered with boxes and lines, all blank and waiting to be filled out. "The process is simple," the supplier continued, picking up a black ink pen, presumably from the same place he had retrieved the ledger. I ask you a few questions, you answer them. If your answers and skill set satisfy, you may come aboard." "What if they don't satisfy?" Casey asked. "Then you are sent back into your community and asked to wait at least 1 year before applying to another convoy." "And you have the final decision on this?" Casey asked. "I am the hiring manager for this convoy," the supplier answered, before falling into another round of silence, as though this fully explained the question. Casey hesitated for only a moment, considering. Other than this, his options were severely limited. Sure, he could take his chances crossing the continent solo, but even if the Dome didn't send someone after him, taking on the wasteland would be tantamount to suicide. Stark, stubborn, and beautiful as a pearl set into diamond, Neil's Dome had been built in the center of the continent's largest desert, a glacier sitting on top of what would become a shallow inland sea over the next 1,000,000 years. For now, the glacier was pocked with pools of salt water which were fed by hairline fissures in the crust, miles below the ice sheet. Its only inhabitants were extremophiles like sponges, microbes, and the Neil's Dome community. Life clinging to existence as if to spite the frozen wasteland. Casey made the only reasonable choice. "All right, shoot. Ask away." At first, the questions were simpler than Casey had feared. They mostly revolved around what his responsibilities were in the Dome. He worked in hydroponics, his life spent increasing the Dome's food production marginally faster than its population could increase itself. He was able to answer technical questions and even show how his knowledge of fluid dynamics applied to the distribution of lubricant, coolant, sewage, and any other fluids on which the rig and its population depended. Then, something in the conversation shifted. "It always rains," the hiring manager commented, as if picking up the thread of a conversation only recently abandoned. His eyes loomed at Casey like heterochromic LEDs. "What's that?" Casey asked, mentally backpedaling to see if he had missed something. "In Lavina," the manager explained. "It always rains. It never stops, even when it's sunny, and that's only in the very early mornings and late evenings." "Sounds nice," Casey said automatically, unsure how to respond. "Not particularly," the manager replied. "Personally, I hate it more each time. So, why do you want to go there?" The question made Casey come up short. "Does it matter?" he finally asked. "Yes," the manager replied. "I know to you this is nothing more than transportation across the wastes, but I live here." The man pointed up at the rig, imperious as an emperor showing off a map of recently conquered territory. "This is my home, and if I'm going to welcome you within, I deserve to know your reason for wanting to leave your home." Again, Casey wasn't sure how to answer. The man was right, of course. Dome residents almost never left. Those who did usually did so as part of a group of officials specializing in negotiation or trade. Someone in Casey's position would not be welcomed aboard any convoy. "I need a change of pace," Casey said after a moment. It was all he could think to say. "Not a very satisfactory answer," the manager said, mouth twitching into a frown. Casey sighed inwardly. He didn't want it to come to this, but it was looking like once again all other choices were being cut off from him. "Look," he said, voice measured and calm. "I'm a highly trained specialist, willing to trade some of my knowledge and give a donation in exchange for safe passage." Casey was never a rich man, but he'd squirreled away little handfuls over the years. Spare tools, motors, and tubing, as well as seed or spore samples. The entirety of his life savings went into the Dome's black market right before he left. Casey walked away with about 10,000 Roy in his pocket, of which he had just under 8,000 left. He'd also kept 3 pouches of seeds for himself, vacuum-sealed into the lining of his jacket. The manager looked down at Casey's hand, which held 7,000 Roy. "And is this an official donation, or—" The manager trailed off, his silence speaking for him. "I leave that to your discretion," Casey replied with a shrug, sweat beginning to form on his upper lip. The manager's eyes, one gray-green, the other deep brown, were alive with the spark of avarice. Casey had no idea what his money was worth outside of the Neil's Dome community, but apparently luck, or at least the supplier's economy, was with him. The hiring manager nodded once, jerking his head forward as he made Casey's money disappear behind the counter. Then, he set the pen in the crease at the center of the ledger and turned it to face Casey. "Fill out the personal information and you're in," he said. "The trip will take 12 weeks total. We won't stop between here and Lavina, so I hope you're not looking to go sightseeing." Casey filled out the ledger and then was shown to his quarters. It was sleek and comfortable in a constantly re-sterilized kind of way. Bolted-down rubber furniture filled the space. A desk, 2 chairs, and wardrobe, all stylized and printed to imitate wood. The walls were padded and painted in a stark white, broken only by a single round window that was clear but unopenable. Under the window stood a metal sink, shelf, and grooming mirror. "The door's biometric," the hiring manager said. He indicated a small plastic rectangle above the handle. "You can set it to your handprint from the panel here. Someone will come by tomorrow and give you the standard new guy welcome. For now, if you need food or to use the facilities, there is a map hanging inside the wardrobe. It's self-locating as well as interactive, so you're not likely to get lost." "Sounds good," Casey said. "Thank you." As soon as the hiring manager left, Casey took the map out of the wardrobe. The Skunk Babe was a town in itself, different areas of the rig each highlighted in their own color. Blue for recreation centers and shops, green for finance and inter-rig commerce. Orange was work and construction, red to pink were varying levels of restricted, and so on. The paths to get from one place to another bent their way through the bowels of the rig like tunnels in an anthill. His current location was far to one side, indicated by a single yellow blip. After setting the door to accept his handprint, Casey left his room, his quarters, he supposed now, to do something. When he escaped the dome, he had done so without grabbing anything other than his jacket. All that had been in its pockets was a smokeless lighter and multi-tool pliers. The next several hours were spent purchasing toiletries, finding the nearest restroom, and getting a meal. The whole time, Casey couldn't stop wondering at the sheer number of people around him. At first, he was surprised that nobody gave him a second glance despite his non-supplier clothes and blatant use of a map. After some discreet people-watching, however, he saw that very few were dressed alike and that many used some sort of navigational aid. When he got back to his quarters, Casey put his newly bought toiletries away and counted how much money he had left. 750 Roy wasn't a lot, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had made it this far. He lay on his bed, eyes closed as he pictured the convoy menagerie in its entirety. Nearly 200 rigs in the convoy, with each rig home to thousands. He would make it to Lavina. Even if the dome did send someone out after him, he would be kept safe by the sheer number of people. How could they find him? The next 3 weeks passed in a state of relative bliss. He spent most of each day working near the engine room, where there were always peacekeepers, the rig's version of security officers, posted on watch. The work itself was not that interesting, but it was delicate enough to demand his full attention and keep his mind off of the fact of his exile. Whether working, eating, or using toilets, Casey was never fully alone. At night, he bought sleep aids from one of the shops and fell into dreamless, medicated unconsciousness. He was beginning to feel safe. The fourth week shattered that sense of safety, revealing it for the illusion that it was. That was the week passengers and crew alike began to disappear. At first, he was able to ignore it as either gossip or coincidence. As more people started to vanish, however, a feeling of being constantly watched settled on the convoy. The disappearances went on for 2 more weeks, each day bringing a fresh round of paranoia on Casey. Anxiety and guilt ate him alive. The skin on his face, once smooth and brown as polished cherry wood, now broke into hairline wrinkles with each minor expression. The loose curl of his beard was lightening faster than he would have thought possible. Once black whiskers, now light brown and gray, gave him a dusty look as though he had just dunked his head into a pile of cigarette ash. At week 6, Casey found himself on the skunk babe's roof. Once again, he felt options disappearing like bubbles under a heat gun. He had been invited to the roof by the peacekeepers. The convoy trade manager himself, Ingram III, wanted to speak with Casey. He hadn't even tried to resist, guessing correctly that to do so would have meant death, or, at the very least, imprisonment. Casey and Ingram faced each other, each sitting on one of 2 chairs set out for the meeting. Between them was a small table, on which sweated 2 iced teas. Ingram stared at Casey, smirking as if able to read his innermost thoughts. Casey studied the man in return, trying not to show how intimidated he was. Ingram was big, not just tall, but broad-shouldered and sharp-featured. He wore the simple uniform shared by all suppliers, pocketed jumpsuit and tool vest. "What can I do for you, boss?" Casey asked, breaking the silence. He was surprised at how steady his voice sounded. "Just wanted to talk, Case. And stop with the boss thing. It makes me feel weird," Ingram responded, at last breaking eye contact and taking a sip of his tea. Casey did the same. After a moment, Ingram spoke again. "Want to smoke a bit before the sun disappears?" "I appreciate the offer, but I'm out right now," Casey said with a smile that was only a little forced. "I'm waiting for ration day to re-up my supply." "You smoke too much, Case," Ingram said, sighing. "I'll tell you what I told my crew. Cigs lose their significance if you don't save them for special occasions." As he spoke, he pulled out a small rectangular packet. It was gray-green with no label, only a bold printed unit number. Despite this, Casey knew exactly what was inside. Developed by Dr. Sandra Neal herself over 4 centuries ago, Sandra's bud was designed to heighten awareness and focus while lowering anxiety. The drug's efficacy made it all but indispensable, so much so that Dome residents had modified their bodies to counteract the more carcinogenic side effects. Over the last 50 years, it had become one of the few things that the Dome traded with other communities. Casey eyed Ingram, wondering how his host's non-adapted body would react to the bud's long-term effects. Ingram pulled out a cig before sliding the pack toward Casey. "Here," he said. "Help yourself." "Thanks," Casey said, his sense of unease rising. The suppliers were funny about gifts and debts. Not unreasonable, just a little funny. He had to keep reminding himself that these people looked and very nearly sounded like him, but they did not think the same. Casey could feel Ingram's impatience. Already he had hesitated too long. His right hand suddenly clutched one of the cigs, his left taking a flameless lighter out of his pocket. He expertly pressed the heated copper coil to the tip of the cig without causing it to crumple. He inhaled long and deep, the smoke saturating his lungs. Odorless, bluish-gray smoke rose as he exhaled and braced for the feeling of lightheadedness that would inevitably follow. It came, but not as strong as Casey wanted. This bothered him more than anything else. His tolerance had gone up even as his own stash disappeared. Casey stuck the lighter back into one of his pockets, closed the lid to the pack of cigs, and made to hand it back to Ingram. Ingram raised his own hand in refusal. "Keep it," Ingram said, his expression unreadable as he exhaled his own cloud of smoke. "After all, it was your bribe that paid for it." "Is that right?" Casey asked, stomach tightening at the word bribe. Words like that were only ever used when words like sentencing were close behind. "Well, Manager Ingram, my donation was given in good faith. I left its use to the discernment of your hiring manager." The corners of Ingram's mouth twitched up, something close to humor touching his face. "I like you, Casey. I hope you can answer my next question with the same amount of tact." Casey tried to swallow, but found his throat dry. He took another sip of his tea, hoping the tremble in his hands wasn't as noticeable as it felt. "So tell me, what do you have to do with these recent disappearances?" Ingram asked this with no room to wiggle or obfuscate the question. He knew Casey was involved. The only options left to Casey were to lie or tell the truth. He decided to split the difference. "It seems like my former community is a bit sore about my leaving," Casey answered. This was, quite literally, not a lie, and thus true. "Cut the bullshit, Case," Ingram said, eyes flat, confident smirk disappearing fast as the sun behind a cloud bank. "Do you know how many of my people have died? How many of my passengers are now clamoring for repayment due to breach of contract? My top advisor is telling me to have you bound and left to the side of the convoy as a show of goodwill to the Sisters of the Dome." Casey shuddered at that, not wanting to imagine what the Dome's leadership would do to him should he be returned to their care. "I presume," Casey responded, "based on the present circumstances, that you have something else in mind." Ingram's smirk returned, but his eyes were still cold and flat. "My deal is 3 parts. You either accept all of them or reject all of them. There is no room for negotiation. First, you tell me why the hell the Dome wants you so bad. Second, you're going to help me kill the bastard who's been terrorizing my passengers and crew." "What about the third part?" Casey asked. "We'll come to that if you survive parts 1 and 2. "And what if I refuse to go along with this deal?" "Then I'll snap your neck and throw you off the roof." Ingram said this without heat or anger. It was a simple statement of fact, like commenting on the time of day. Casey held the cig to his mouth, not responding for several minutes as he turned it into a nub of orange-red ash. At last, he spoke. "I killed someone." The words came out strong, even though they felt like shards of glass in his throat. The memory of the deed was still sharp in Casey's mind, the details as painfully clear as laser-etched lettering. The sun filtering through his window, landing on her, a beautifully shaped sunspot slowly growing cold. There had been no pain. The poison did its work quickly and efficiently. It had looked as though she was still sleeping. Just sleeping, peacefully on his bed as she had done so many times after they made love. Ingram said nothing, so Casey continued. "Had I done differently, I would have only succeeded in feeding the mushrooms along with them." "Was it self-defense or euthanasia?" Ingram's voice held no heat, no condemnation. It was worse. He sounded understanding, as if he knew exactly what Casey was experiencing. Without knowing why, Casey felt resentment bubble up inside him. "A bit of both," Casey responded. "I did what seemed necessary at the time." "You're obviously not telling me everything," Ingram said. For a moment, Casey could feel his life hanging in the balance as Ingram weighed Casey's response and came to a verdict. "I can live with that. For now, so can you." "Now what?" Casey asked, once he was sure his voice would not crack. "Now you and I work together to stop a homicidal maniac," Ingram said, grabbing the pack of cigs and lighting another. "You will be the bait. We have him cornered, I think. As far as we can tell, he's somewhere in the turbine room, maybe in one of the vents. So why not send your security people down there? Flush him out yourselves?" Casey asked. "Because you brought death to my convoy. And because I'm not risking a firefight in the heart of the babe." Ingram's voice came out hot as steam escaping a valve, each word oozing derision. The two men locked eyes with each other. Casey was the first to blink and look away. "Do I have a choice?" Casey asked, voice grim. "You have the same choice we all do, Case," Ingram replied, his anger recontained. "You can choose to trade with the resources Lord Hysara gives you, or not." Casey couldn't argue. At the end of the day, Ingram was right. Casey doubted he could make it the rest of the way to Lavina with the supplies he had and no way of purchasing more. His money had been all but useless since the convoy menagerie left the dome. He had no play to make other than taking Ingram's deal. "If I had any balls, I'd let Ingram snap my neck," Casey thought. "It would be no less than what I deserve." That thought brought back memories, which he immediately tried to shove into the murk of his subconscious. Desperate for anything to take his mind off the past, Casey took another cig out of its pack and set it alight. He inhaled, eyes closed, and felt his shoulders unclench. When Casey's eyes reopened, he found Ingram staring at him, long fingers clenching and unclenching, as if getting ready to pull Casey's head off his shoulders. "Tell me the plan, Manager Ingram," Casey said, fighting for calm. "What exactly do you need me to do?" You have been listening to Dead Arcology, written and recorded by me, Michael K. Ostis. If you enjoyed this story, please consider sharing it. I have episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Podbean, as well as several others. Updates, schedules, and news can be found on the website, deadarcology.com, as well as on the social media apps Blue Sky and Instagram under the username Dead Arcology. If you want to help Dead Arcology grow more directly, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/deadarcology. Thank you again for listening. It really helps a lot. I very much appreciate you giving this story your time, and I will see you in about 2 weeks. Goodbye.